For years, Soviet spaceflight was veiled in secrecy behind the Iron Curtain. The world was shown the successes. The difficulties, failures and disasters remained a well-guarded secret. Officially, scenes like these never happened. Still, with the launching of the first Sputnik, a new age had begun. The 21 days during which it transmitted its famous beep, beep, beep back to Earth had transformed the consciousness of the world. In the middle of the Cold War, the area of space closest to Earth became the battling ground in the superpowers' competition for technological advantage and prestige, a contest which remains undecided even today. Under the guidance of Chief Engineer Sergei Korolev, the era of manned spaceflight began with Yuri Gagarin. The race to the moon between the Soviet Union and the USA was one of the main features of the 1960s. And it was this competition which brought the superpowers together in the early 70s to discuss the peaceful use of space. With the opening of the Soviet archives, the history of spaceflight must now be rewritten. Its pictures, many of them never published until now, are the record of an arduous but successful path. Where this path leads to, and what usefulness it may have, these are questions for which there may be no answers until the end of this century. Russia at the turn of the century. Kaluga, 100 kilometers south of Moscow, the home of Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. In the idyllic environment of this country town, the self-learned scientist was working on his unconventional notions of space travel as far back as 1880 and earlier, ever fascinated by the idea that man might one day fly to the stars. These scenes from an old newsreel show Tsiolkovsky and his family. Though he was well known and respected in his old age, Tsiolkovsky had to go a long uphill path to pursue his science. His ideas on flying to the cosmos were published at his own costs. In his book Free Space, published in 1883, he describes his ideas on movement in interplanetary space. In 1896, he formulates the basic rocket equation. A few years later, he publishes the first part of his work, Exploration of Cosmic Space by Means of Reaction Devices. With this research, Tsiolkovsky becomes the foremost thinker among space flight pioneers. The dream of flight has always stirred the imagination of mankind. No possibility, however unlikely, was left untried in the pursuit of this goal. In Russia, like everywhere else in those early days, it was no more than a technical adventure. It's not until the military sensed the new possibilities that things really start moving by leaps and bounds. The conquest of the sky then begins with all sorts of flying machines. And before long, the air around us becomes a routine experimental area for daring pioneers. The next step, flight to the stars, soon begins daunting human imagination. In Germany, Hermann Oberth publishes his book, The Rocket into Interplanetary Space, in 1923. Oberth, standing to the right of the rocket in this photo, becomes known beyond the borders of Germany. Before long, a number of groups begin to experiment on rocket propulsion systems with the simplest of means. The first practical trials were made in March 1926. In 1928, Fritz von Opel's famous rocket car reaches a top speed of 230 kilometers an hour on the Berlin-Avus circuit. The principle seems to be viable. Rockets achieve recognition as a means of propulsion. During roughly the same period, the American scientist Robert Goddard is also working on the development of rocket propulsion. The father of rocket technology, as he will come to be known, has been experimenting with various types of fuel at Princeton University since 1915. In 1926, he launches the world's first liquid propellant rocket. After the revolution in Russia, Tsiolkovsky's work has the support of the young Soviet government. But it is not until 1928 that his ideas are systematically put into practice at the Leningrad Gas Dynamics Laboratory. The concept of traveling in space is gaining more and more supporters. And among them, a certain Sergei Korolyov. By the early 1930s, Korolyov has already made a name for himself among experts. An enthusiastic glider pilot and aircraft engineer, he has been studying all aspects of flight for a number of years. But Korolyov wants to do more than simply build airplanes. He is fascinated by the idea of flying in space. In 1934, he publishes Rocket Flight into the Stratosphere. He is one of the founding members of GERD, a group of young space travel enthusiasts at the Leningrad Gas Dynamics Laboratory. He works with Tsiolkovsky and soon becomes the group's leader. The young rocket engineers are working for the Red Army. Their first rocket is launched on the 17th of August 1933. The trials seem promising, but the group's work never gets beyond the experimental stage. Moscow, 1938. Stalin has set a stupendous industrial program in motion. To be ready to face the challenge he still does not believe will come. Europe is on the brink of World War II. In the Soviet Union, a wave of purges is rolling. Marshal Tukhachevsky, the leader and promoter of the rocket program, is executed. Design Office 7 of the GERD Group is dissolved, and Soviet rocket research is interrupted for years. Korolyov is arrested by Stalin's secret police, the NKVD. No reason is given for the arrest, but now for the first time, the arrest warrant has been found in the NKVD archives. Korolyov is sentenced to 10 years in prison and sent to one of the infamous labor camps of the Gulag. For many, this is a one-way trip. World War II has begun. Stalin, putting his trust in the pact with Nazi Germany, remains inactive. When Germany invades the Soviet Union on the 21st of June 1941, the country is so unprepared that it is almost overrun. But within an incredibly short space of time, the entire economy is converted to wartime production. There is no time to think of rocketry now, but there is a need for talented engineers. Tupolev, the well-known aircraft designer, secures Korolyov's release from the Gulag. Still an NKVD prisoner, he is now allowed to design planes to be used against Germany. The Soviet Union has been testing jet aircraft since 1935. Here an RP-318 with the pilot Fyodorov. Korolyov has played an important role in this development. The engine had been designed by Valentin Glushko, later rocket designer and colleague of Korolyov. However, this jet aircraft was never put into serial production. Meanwhile, rocket technology in Germany has made an enormous leap forward under the pressure of military interests there. The first trial launch of a ballistic missile is made in Peenemünde on the 21st of March 1940. By the end of the war, rocket development will have cost the incredible sum of more than 4 billion Reichsmark. The German rocket development efforts do not remain undetected by the Allies. In the night of the 17th to the 18th of August 1943, British bombers devastate the facilities at Peenemünde. Hitler then orders rocket production to be shifted to Nordhausen, a small town on the eastern edge of the Harz Mountains. In the underground galleries of Mittelbau Dora, production continues unabated. The brunt of the work is borne by concentration camp inmates, who have to live and work under inhuman conditions. A total of 60,000 prisoners are used in production. More than 16,000 die in the process. Although the V-2 rockets are used massively in the course of the war, their ultimate effect is insignificant. The V-2 rocket was not efficient as a weapon during the war, but it was extremely interesting as an engineering achievement. It is an undeniable fact that the Germans really did a great deal for the later development of rocket technology. This is a path that simply had to be taken, despite the enormous costs involved. They did a tremendous amount of work that we were able to draw on later.
Но, значит, они проделали огромную работу, которой мы воспользовались.
In the last few days of the war, both the Americans and the Russians do everything they can to get as much German technology and as many designers as possible into their hands. German engineers are now among the most coveted people in Germany. Werner von Braun and the top people in the engineering teams have long since made their decision. On the 12th of May 1945, they surrendered to US troops in Tyrol. These scenes, shot by an American cameraman, show self-assured men in the best of moods. Von Braun is the man with the plaster cast, and the man next to him with the hat is General Dornberger, head of the German rocket development program. They do not come empty-handed. All the documents on German rocket development were in their possession. 4 weeks previously, the Americans had advanced rapidly to occupy the Nordhausen camp. In contravention of the Yalta Agreement, they had hurried to load up more than 100 rockets and ship them off to America. Some 350 trains full of material leave Nordhausen heading west, a priceless booty.
Что нельзя, взорвали.
When Soviet officers reach Nordhausen on the 5th of July, all they find are a few remnants of the production facilities and countless rocket components. This footage was shot shortly after the beginning of Soviet occupation. But Stalin's orders were clear. V-2 production must be resumed as quickly as possible. A group of Soviet experts under Lieutenant Colonel Shabinsky arrives in Nordhausen and sets about immediate reconstruction of the production facilities. One of these experts is Sergei Korolyov, by now a colonel in the Red Army. The years in the Gulag are forgotten. Korolyov has been appointed chief engineer of the Soviet rocket development program. On his right is Boris Chertok, who reminisces about those days. Not only the qualified rocket builders came to us, but also German experts from various disciplines who had not previously worked with von Braun in Peenemünde. We simply needed experts to help us restore and re-establish the long-range rocket technology that had been developed in Peenemünde.
Реконструировать технику ракет дальнего действия, которые разрабатывались в Пeenemünde.
Work in Nordhausen gets underway without delay. By the end of the year, the workforce has grown to more than 600. This film material was top secret for decades. It shows collaboration between Soviet and German engineers, something which official Soviet historians had always denied. In October 45, Korolyov visits Nordhausen to see how production is coming along. The first V-2 rockets are completed in March 46. In Moscow, the rocket program is pushed ahead as part of the new 5-year plan. Under the leadership of the German engineer Helmut Göttrup, there are soon more than 7,000 people working in rocket production in and around Nordhausen. An important military production unit located directly along the western edge of the Soviet sphere of influence. A lieutenant arrived with 6 men and politely informed us that the institute was being moved and that we were to move with it. So of course we asked if we had to go. Yes, he said, you have to go, you have no choice. And then my wife asked this lieutenant how long this relocation would last. At first he ducked the question, because he'd been told not to give any indication of time. But in the end he came out with the answer, well, about 5 years. It turned out to be 6.5.
Keineswegs festzulegen mit einer Zeitangabe. Nachher rückte dann schließlich raus, na so ungefähr 5 Jahre. Es sind dann 6,5 geworden.
On the 22nd of October 1946, 2 days after the state parliamentary elections in the Soviet zone, more than 3,000 so-called specialists are secretly transferred to the Soviet Union. The operation has been planned well in advance, with hundreds of trains ready to transport the scientists and technicians, their families, their laboratories, test rigs and complete plants. Today this operation has been virtually forgotten, a chapter of history that has yet to be given the attention it deserves.
Не в проворот. Страна лежала в развале.
At the end of World War II, the Soviet Union was confronted with an enormous task. A country to be rebuilt, its people to be given a new productive future. A gigantic economic program was launched, covering the entire country and its people.
Важнейшую техническую, научную и политическую задачу.
But the war losses have been massive, and dictatorship still hinders all genuine development. And at the same time, the Cold War between the two superpowers is starting to gather momentum. The former allies have become implacable enemies. Stalin and his generals still have the final word in the Kremlin. On the 15th of March 1947, Stalin proposes to the Council of Ministers the creation of a government commission for rocket development. He wants to counter the supremacy of the Western Air Forces with the development of a long-range missile weapon based on the V-2. Shortly before the German specialists were press-ganged to the Soviet Union, construction of the first Soviet rocket launching site had begun in Kapustin Yar, near Volgograd. By the time the trains from Germany roll in, the tracks have already been laid and the work can begin. Working and living conditions at Kapustin Yar are primitive. The sole purpose of the center is to further develop German rocket technology at the greatest possible speed. Work here is already done exclusively by Russians. By now, Russian technology has achieved an almost parallel level to the technology brought from Germany. Russian technicians are already in the lead for large segments of development and production. The German specialists work in isolated conditions on details, and for secrecy reasons they are spread out in various institutes all over the country. The entire work is now being carried out under the aegis of a new arm of the Red Army, the rocket troops. Under the old name Aggregate 4 or A4, a new missile is being prepared for launching. The warhead is fixed into place, the rocket is armed and ready to go.
Уже потому трудно, что они были первыми, а первым всегда трудно.
At this stage, only minor technical changes have been made to the old V-2. The booty brought from Germany has become the foundation of a strategic armaments concept which will now, to a large extent, determine the second half of our century. The influence of the German technicians and designers is dwindling. Korolyov, the program director, will tolerate no competition. Until recently, these pictures were not known. All those involved in the experimental work were subject to the strictest supervision, and their names were kept secret. The Soviet teams are working feverishly on the development of rocket technology. Their experience with the A4 is invaluable. Without it, this work would not have been possible. On the 18th of October 1947, the first rocket is launched from Kapustin Yar, still under the direction of German engineers. This is the first of many rockets to be launched from this site. The observers of these top-secret trials include the elite of the country's leadership. They will be the ones making the decisions for the course to be followed from now on. We took the next step in 1950, manufacturing rockets with twice the range. The R-2 rocket was already designed for a range of 600 kilometers. Then came the R-11 with completely new components, a totally new design. In 1956 we launched the R-5 rocket with a range of 1,200 kilometers and a nuclear payload. This missile retained practically nothing from the German legacy, except perhaps for the graphite
на
guidance
1200
systems.
километров уже с атомным зарядом. На этой ракете мало что осталось от немецкого наследия, кроме, может быть, графитовых рулей.
Under military control, and at a time when everyone believed that a confrontation between the superpowers was inevitable, the engineers continue their work on the new weapons under the very highest pressure. Stalin dies at the beginning of March 1953. During the struggle for his succession, rockets become a political instrument, a weapon for the Cold War. Since 1942, Soviet scientists had been working on the development of the atomic bomb with the same intensity as the rocket program. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the foremost goal was to catch up with atomic technology in the USA. Igor Kurchatov is the leader and spiritual father of the Soviet atomic bomb. Developing a powerful long-range rocket as a carrier for the bomb becomes the declared goal of the Soviet arms program. On the 15th of March 1953, developments take a giant step forwards. The world's first intermediate-range missile, the R-5, is ready for launch. In August of the same year, the Soviet Union's first hydrogen bomb is detonated. This original film material shows the devastating effect of the explosion on the test site in Siberia. The scientists are now on the brink of the decisive step. That was in 53 or 54. The concept of the intercontinental missile had already crystallized. What it was to be like, its characteristics, its range of 8,000 to 10,000 kilometers, and the mass of the bomb it was to carry. Our nuclear engineers were talking about 5.5 tons. Of course, the figure they mentioned was smaller. But after all, this bomb had to be carried to its target. It entered the atmosphere at a very high velocity, and a plasma of several thousand degrees formed around it. Taking all these factors into consideration, the engineers specified that the mass of the payload, the bomb plus the thermal protection it would need, should be around 5.5 tons. Then work was started to develop a missile to this specification, the missile that was later known as the R-7.
И стали делать ракету. Ту ракету, которая потом стала известна Р-7.
By 1956, Khrushchev has finally consolidated his position in the Politburo as General Secretary of the Communist Party. He closes the final chapter of the Stalinist era and gives the country new and vital impulses. In the meantime, a new city for the rockets and their engineers has been created in Kazakhstan. Baikonur becomes a symbol of the future development of Soviet spaceflight. Most of the official space missions will start here, in the solitude of the steppes, until today. By this time, missiles are being built in series production. At vast expense, the costs will probably never be determined, an industry has been created, facing the engineers with ever new and more complex requirements. This footage shows the first R-7 missiles being assembled. Today we know the names of the designers, but for many years their names were among the best-kept secrets in the Soviet Union. Standing almost 40 meters tall, with a thrust of 510 tons, the R-7 is finally ready for launch by the beginning of 1957. Korolev is on the verge of achieving his personal goal. But the first trials with the R-7 turn out to be failures. The missiles are torn apart by gigantic explosions shortly after launching. On the 21st of August 1957, success at last. The world's first intercontinental missile is launched without a hitch and lands on target. The Soviet leadership was so sure of its technology that it had announced the launch the day before. Korolev believes the time has come for a new concept. He has never abandoned his idea of a civil application of missile technology. In Khrushchev, he has found a strong political ally.
Наибольший, так сказать, прогресс.
We made the greatest progress and got the most stimuli for the development of our cosmonaut program at the time of Nikita Khrushchev. He attached tremendous importance to the development of spaceflight, and incidentally, it was not military applications but cosmonaut activities that enabled him to demonstrate the lead and the capabilities of Soviet science and technology. Its superiority over American science and technology, for instance. I would say he used the whole thing very successfully for propaganda purposes.
В частности, над американской, он очень удачно, я бы сказал, использовал это с целью пропаганды и агитации.
In the secrecy of Baikonur, preparations are being made for the next step in the conquest of the cosmos. An R-7 is about to become the carrier rocket for the world's first artificial satellite in space. There are only a few hours left before the launch. Korolev approaches his goal. This is the idea he proposed 30 years ago, and the decisive step is now imminent. The first real step into space, on the way to the stars. The Sputnik, in English traveling companion, is a small aluminium sphere with a diameter of 58 centimeters and a weight of only 84 kilos. The night of the 4th of October 1957, the R-7 rocket carrying Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, lifts off with a tremendous roar. The Sputnik orbits the Earth at a speed of 28,000 kilometers per hour. Radio hams throughout the world receive its signals. The Western world is stunned. The myth of the West's supremacy destroyed in one blow.
Раз и навсегда был похоронен старый миф. В те дни он не знал, как ярко и резко отразится в зеркале спутника вся наша эпоха.
At his death in 1935, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky was convinced that his colleagues would live to see the launch of the first space rocket. Now, only 3 weeks after what would have been his 100th birthday, his dream has become reality, ushering in a new chapter of history. Even though the military are still dictating the terms of development, the rocket builders are thinking ahead along their own lines. Korolev, under a pseudonym, writes that it is now technically possible to reach the moon from the Earth by means of powerful rockets. Shortly afterwards, Korolev and design engineer Tikhon Ravov publish a memorandum on a moon flight using a Vostok rocket. Meanwhile, the American Vanguard program, which is just getting underway, suffers one setback after another. Werner von Braun, director of the American Military Rocket Development Program, addresses Congress, calling for massive political support and, above all, funding. In view of the Soviet successes, he finally gets free rein and is also put in charge of the civil program. Explorer 1, launched on the 31st of January 1958, is the first American satellite to orbit the Earth. 6 months later, the North American Space Agency, NASA, is created. Every step in space is a new step for science, and at the same time a trump card in the propaganda war of the political systems. At the beginning of October 1959, Luna 3 orbits the Moon and transmits the first pictures of its dark side. The pictures are a sensation and make great propaganda for Khrushchev, who visits the USA for the first time in September 1959. At his meeting with President Eisenhower, Khrushchev presents a gift, a miniature Sputnik. This will not be the only time during his visit that Khrushchev reminds the Americans of Soviet spaceflight successes. Shortly afterwards, during a propaganda event in Vladivostok, Khrushchev asks why Soviet spaceflight is so successful and provides the answer to his own question. Because our social system is the right one. Khrushchev is adept at kindling the enthusiasm of his country for space exploration. There is no country in the world where the development of spaceflight is given as much attention as in the Soviet Union. From 1951 onwards, the Soviets had been experimenting with high-altitude rockets to study the atmospheric layers close to the Earth and to test the effects of spaceflight on living organisms. The bitch Laika was the first hero of spaceflight. After 5 days in space, she was put to sleep, as no return system had yet been developed for the capsule.
То скатапультируем дальше, высота 250, 450, полет, байки, стрелки, белки.
But new physical, biomedical and technical experience was being gathered at an increasingly rapid pace.
Научно обоснована возможность полета человека в космическое пространство.
In 1960, space scientists succeed in bringing experimental animals back to Earth for the first time. The capsule has landed, just 10 kilometers from its specified target. Another major step towards the first manned spaceflight. At this point, the animals still have the star roles, but the engineers and scientists are not far from their goal. We observed the behavior of the animals and their condition during flight. Then the capsules parachuted down and we examined the animals again in great detail. This confirmed our view that it was possible to survive space flight. The first flight of man into the cosmos is almost within reach. At the end of 1959 in Orenburg, a first group of young Red Army pilots is selected for cosmonaut training. The group includes Yuri Gagarin and Alexei Leonov. The 19 pilots do not know yet that they are reporting for a mission that will determine the whole course of their lives. They will become the players in one of the greatest adventures in human history. But first, these volunteers have to undergo inconceivably tough training at the Star City Space Center near Moscow. They have to be prepared for absolutely any eventuality. This is a step into the unknown, and a very risky one indeed. Their training is based on a whole series of assumptions. As tough as it is only the preparation for a dangerous experiment. I think they were rather unfortunate. They were the subjects of unusually tough experiments, a whole series of criteria that we would no longer examine now. Today, there's no need for this kind of training. But it was a good thing to check the super reliability of these men and to rule out any possibility of their failing. Meanwhile, a whole space industry has been created. The technical problems to be faced are a tremendous challenge. Developing a stabilization system to cope with free fall, a returnable pressurized cabin, a retro-rocket braking system, the mechanism to separate rocket and payload, and a great deal more besides. Some of the technologies developed by these engineers are still used in spaceflight today. Landing is a special problem. In view of the tremendous expanse of the Soviet Union, the engineers concentrate on a ground landing rather than a splashdown, right from the start. In order to protect the cosmonauts from the hard impact of landing, they are to be catapulted out in an ejector seat following re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. The first rockets are assembled at record speed. And very soon, an R-7 rocket with the Vostok capsule is rolled out to the launching pad.
На первый план был выдвинут корабль для полета с человеком.
Priority was given to the spaceship for manned flight. This project had been pursued at top pressure from the end of 1958 onwards. Just imagine, the official decision was made in autumn 1958. The following spring, the first landing gear housings were already set up in the workshops. They were really handmade at the time, and by the end of 1959, the first spaceship had already been assembled.
А в конце 1959 года уже натуральный корабль был первый собран.
The launch trials with Vostok run from May onwards. But the first launches are failures. These losses are routine. Up to 10 launches are planned before the first successful flight. But the scientists and technicians are working under tremendous time pressure. NASA is already planning a manned space flight for the near future. And suddenly, an incident which heightens political tensions. Something the Americans had previously considered impossible. On the 1st of May 1960, a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft piloted by Gary Powers is shot down during an intelligence flight over the Soviet Union. Once more, Soviet technology astonishes the world.
Поэтому
The powerful military-industrial complex that had become established in the Soviet Union and the USA, that was the scientific and technical basis. Without this basis, the development of civil spaceflight would not have been possible. If it had not been for this powerful manufacturing and scientific basis, which had actually been developed only for defense purposes, there would have been no potential for the development of civil programs.
И того потенциала, который был накоплен в интересах обороны и в интересах военного ведомства, не было основы и возможностей для разработки совершенно не военных программ.
By chance, a cameraman happens to capture the greatest disaster in Soviet rocket development, which occurred on the 24th of October 1960. Marshal Nedelin, the head of the strategic rocket forces, falls victim to the flames together with a further 89 people. The official version is that the marshal was killed in a plane accident. The test phase of the Vostok is completed in early 1961, with the last 3 of them flying successfully. Launch preparations begin for manned flight. Although not officially nominated, there are only 2 cosmonauts still in training for the flight. The launching date is indirectly dictated by the Americans. They have scheduled their first manned flight with the astronaut Alan Shepard for May. In a ritual which still takes place today, a state commission announces on the 11th of April that Yuri Gagarin will fly, while his partner on the ground will be German Titov. Everything is set. Vostok 1 is ready for launching. The design engineer takes leave of his first cosmonaut. These pictures have often been shown, but watching them, we can still feel the boldness of this first step into space. We were not 100% convinced of the reliability of the rocket technology. We still had a feeling of unease. The spaceship might have ended up on a considerably higher orbit, and we would not have been able to get it back to Earth. And essential supplies were limited to 12 days.
Всего необходимого для человека на борту был ограничен всего 12 днями.
This day, the 12th of April 1961, has gone down in history. Yuri Gagarin takes off for the first space flight by a human being. With its weight of nearly 300 tons, the rocket rises skywards at 3:56 in the morning, Central European time. 108 long minutes for Gagarin, Korolev, and everyone involved. On re-entry into the atmosphere, Gagarin is catapulted out in his ejector seat at an altitude of 4,000 meters and lands safely in the steppe. Not long afterwards, the capsule is viewed by a group of dignitaries. The news is a sensation. The whole country celebrates its hero. The personable cosmonaut becomes the representative of technical progress, the symbol of hope for a better future. And on his world tour, he becomes the celebrated ambassador of a political idea. Khrushchev's idea is paying off. John F. Kennedy, the new American president, has been in office since January. He reacts at once to the Soviet challenge. On the 25th of May, he announces his space program to Congress.
These are extraordinary times, and we face an extraordinary challenge. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
Kennedy's speech is the official opening of the superpowers' race to the moon. And at the same time, it sets the deadline, the end of the decade.